Najmi. Hey, Miss Najmi, Principal Najmi. So we have a returning guest now. I think you've been with us 3 times now, Dr. Williams, right?
I have. Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to talk about current events, and that was earlier in the week. And now I wasn't sure what we talk about, but now I know. So we had you on talking about the Black Panther movement, the Black Power movement, Stokely Carmichael. We had that super awesome conversation about like why the youth are, you know, the young movements and stuff like that today. And you had talked a bit about Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
And well, back up in the news again.
In a big way, here in Minneapolis.
Yeah, so want to tell everyone, I don't know if people can comment, but if you want, comment in the comment box. Do you know what happened? Do you know about the incident in Minneapolis? Does anyone know about what happened in Minneapolis? Well, you know, we're just going to talk about it, and then they can comment. Say yes if you do, or give us hearts. But I get George Floyd. Yep.
New York City, Kellen.
So tell us. So Kellen, you're right. Want to do us? Okay, let's do some contextualization. What got us to the violence in the streets last night? So let's do some context, but some recent context. So what got us here to last night?
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, you can answer. Yeah.
Well, I think a couple of things. If everyone obviously has been paying attention, and we talked about this in the context of our conversation about the civil rights movement, there is this perception that the United States has come a long way with regard to race relations. And in many ways, that's true. We abolished slavery in 1865. You got a 14th Amendment in 1868, a 15th Amendment in 1870. And then for more than a century, it felt like those promises of freedom and democracy were not crystallized until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, which we studied. After that movement, there was also this expectation that things would change in a substantive way. But as we talked about, we still have the vestiges of inequality in the form of what we call the 6 degrees of segregation: housing, education, Jim Crow justice, which has proved the most intractable of those 6 degrees. And what you saw on Monday in Minneapolis was a manifestation of Jim Crow justice. Here's a guy, George Floyd, accused of a minor infraction. They said it was a potential forgery. And then literally we watched somebody videotape his death at the hands of Minneapolis police. The critical differences between today and 100 years ago, obviously, or even 50 years ago, is videotape. So there's always been a history of these types of incidents involving African Americans in law enforcement or mob violence, and there were no video cameras. But today, because there are video cameras and people have the ability to record, we actually watched real time his tragic death. And now there are questions about the police, the conduct of the police, and how we address that, particularly for Black and brown communities who are looking at this and saying, where's the justice here?
Yeah, and Callum just wrote, Will Smith said, it's not getting worse, it's just being recorded.
Yep, exactly.
And so last night, there was a reaction. And you and I were talking before this chat, and we were talking about some parallels to other incidents, recent to us, Baltimore, but even LA in 1993 feels recent, although these babies weren't even born yet. They were like, not even... Yeah. Anyway, their parents are like younger than us, which is crazy, I think. But so what I guess in a larger picture, what leads to that kind of violence that you start seeing in reaction to police injustice? Like, I don't know if everyone who's watching us now saw, because we were talking too, like, it's not all over the news, but if you went on Twitter or even probably TikTok or Snapchat, you saw it. And and also, by the way, guess where Dr. Williams lives? Minneapolis. So he saw smoke this morning. But tell us, I guess my question is, how do we go from police injustice, shooting of a Black man, to these fires? Like, why does this always happen? That's my basic question.
So, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King talked about this in one of his books, where he said, violence and rioting is the language of the unheard. When people can't express their disaffection with social inequality, with political inequality, with economic disparity, the way in which they are able to be heard is by striking out at the tangible signs of inequality in their own community. And what are those signs? Well, if you live in a community where you can't afford to shop at the Walmart or the Target, that becomes one of the targets. If you live in a community where you pass every day iPhones in a store that you can't purchase, that becomes a target. If you pass the police who are there and you perceive them to be there not to serve and protect, but to control and corral your community, they become a target. So it's those kind of structures within the community that become targets of rioters. And as I said, Martin Luther King said, that's the language of the unheard. In a lot of ways, too, for us, as we're kind of watching this play out here in Minneapolis and other places, it's also this sense of despair and people who are, making the case that, look, what do I have to lose? Because I don't have a stake in this society. I don't have a stake in this community in the same way that people who have things do. So it's also the expression of those who are disaffected because they don't have what they perceive to be a stake in the society. That could come from the fact that they don't believe that they are represented by those people that are elected into office. It could come from the fact that they don't believe that they're getting adequate education or they don't have access to adequate housing. Well, all those things factor into violence or rioting as an expression of that disaffection. And one of the critical kernels or the wick that always tends to lead to these episodes. It happened in Miami in 1981, happened in Harlem in 1943, it happened in Watts in 1955, in Detroit in 1967, New Haven, Connecticut in 1967, is some incident of police brutality where it crystallizes for people, hey, look, we're not just imagining this. This is the reality of how we live and how we're perceived. It happened with Michael Brown, of course, in St. Louis, Missouri, and now George Floyd is the latest manifestation of that.
Yeah. And then do you want, take us back to that, because I know you were involved, I don't know if you were involved in the protesting, but you were definitely involved, you've been involved with Black Lives Matter. We talked a little bit about it in our Zoom class or Google Meet. Tell us a little more about Black Lives Matter, what role they played in the protesting last night, and what role they've played within the movement, just to remind people, because we haven't talked about that in a while.
Well, it's interesting because in terms of last night, in terms of here in Minneapolis, there are still pockets of Black Lives Matter activists who are very much active in this community, owing to the death of Philando Castile here in 2016, shortly before I came to Minneapolis, which was another nationally televised murder captured on camera of a police officer that shot an African-American gentleman in the middle of the afternoon who worked at a school. And here in Minnesota, it's a right to carry state. So if you have a permit, you're allowed to have a weapon. Philando Castile was reaching for his permit and this officer shot him anyway because he claimed that he was being threatened and he was reaching for his gun. But again, because we saw the video of that, we know that that doesn't jive with the story that ultimately was offered for why that violence took place and why Philando Castile was killed. So Black Lives Matter has been a factor here because the rallying cry of the protesters on Monday before the rioting that took place last night was very much steeped in the language of Black Lives Matter, which became a thing really after the Trayvon Martin case, where people were trying to crystallize in some way the anger and frustration they were feeling at the number of Black people, Black and brown people who are killed by the police without any accountability. And so Black Lives Matter was this cry of, hey, look, Black life is worth something. So whether we're talking about young Black man who's killed in the subway system in Oakland, California by police, or whether we're talking about Sean Bell in New York City, right, or Amadou Diallo or Sandra Bland in Texas, these lives matter, and we've got to give voice to that by pointing to what should be obvious to people. These were human beings, they had families, they deserve better than what they got at the hands of police who were supposed to be there to serve and protect. Which brings us back to our conversation about the Black Panthers, right, and how the Black Panther Party was formed. And point number 5 of their 10-point program was all about self-defense, because this has a long yet hidden history in the African-American community.
Yeah. What do you say? Because I know that our students often get into discussions and debates with people, and sometimes people troll them online. A common trope is, I'm going to say it out loud, and it makes me cringe, all lives matter.
It drives me crazy too.
Like, how do you respond? I mean, how do you normally respond to that if someone trolls you online and says, well, all lives matter? What's a good comeback to that?
I get that all the time. And my response to people when they say that is this: if that's true, then we should be compelled to be concerned about those lives that are most in jeopardy. So if you want to say all lives matter, then you should really be interested in Black lives, because if we're looking at what's taking place in this country, from Ahmaud Arbery to George Floyd, to other incidents that we can point to from this year alone, it's clear. If we're looking at the impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, Black and Latino communities, where it has a disproportionate impact. I think 73 or 75% of the deaths in Washington, D.C. from COVID-19 are African American. I believe it's 25% in New York City. So if we're looking at those statistics and you want to say all lives matter, then should we put our attention where those problems are most acute? Those are in Black and brown communities, so Black lives matter. If you really believe that, then you should be looking for Black lives.
That is such a good comeback. I hope everyone heard that and took notes. Well, I'm recording this so we can play it again. Speaking of New York City, there was an incident on Monday. I don't know if you thought, I'm kind of in Minneapolis. You know all about that, right? And hey, people watching, are you guys following the story of what could have happened, but could have been even worse, but was pretty bad, happened in Central Park? Did you all see that news from Monday? You know the story? And we're the high school for environmental studies, right? The girl with the leash. Yeah, Kellen is on his news. I was gonna curse. Tip. Yeah, so like a lot of our students watching are environmentalists, and we're the high school for environmental studies. And this guy is like the board of the Audubon Society. And do you want to tell us the story? What happened?
So there was a woman who was out walking her dog on a leash, and an African-American gentleman who happened to be a bird watcher, somebody who is an environmentalist who's, very much involved in preservation of the environment, politely asked her if she would leash the dog, because the dog was in a section of the park which is where dogs are supposed to be leashed because it's actually preserved for bird watchers, right, and dogs will interfere with. So rather than just abiding by what was a very polite request, the woman threatened him by saying, "I'm going to call the police and tell them that an African-American is attacking me." And she proceeded to goad him in this way, and then actually did make the phone call in which she, presented this false narrative about being attacked by this man who simply had made this request and who was very calmly taping her the whole time. The reason this resonated so powerfully with communities of color is for a long time, there have been people who've complained about police coming into a situation and based on the color of the so-called perpetrator's skin, behaving in ways that are very brutal toward those people. The fact that the Amy Cooper incident happened in such close proximity to George Floyd was an indication to a lot of people that if the New York City police had believed her tale, had it come in with the same mentality that the Minneapolis police did with George Floyd, it could have been a tragedy. It would all have been based on a lie. And it actually happens a lot. Like Black and Latino youth complain about this in large numbers, that somebody will call the police about somebody being suspicious or being too loud or driving while Black. And we've all heard those expressions before. And then the police will come in and oftentimes will be very brutal in their treatment of those so-called suspects. And those are tragedies when that violence can result in the death or injury to those individuals. We just happened, the proximity was so powerful, happened to watch those two things play out in tandem. And it was scary because it reminded a lot of people that based on the lie of Amy Cooper, that gentleman could have been very badly hurt.
Yeah, and if you watch, I recommend that everyone watch that video because you see what she does. When the police first, you could tell that when she first calls, the response isn't what she wanted. They're probably like, "Wait, what?" Like you're feeling threatened. But then she mentioned that he was African American immediately. Mm-hmm. And then when she didn't get the immediate response, her voice went from like 5 to 20. Like she suddenly sounded like she was about to get stabbed or shot.
Yep.
And it was like, I don't think anyone else was that shocked to see her doing that, but I'm really glad he took out his video camera. And then there was another incident that I just saw on Twitter. And then we're going to flip this and talk about what we can do. Because I feel like a lot of times these conversations, and it is natural to feel a little helpless and hopeless right now in the context of a global pandemic and seeing these like racist things come onto the surface again. But just one other incident I just saw too, that I think should be in the news, is there was a young man in San Antonio, Texas. He ran a traffic light. The police, went after him. There were like, if you watch the video, it looks like there's 15 police. His sister or family member started recording. He was down on the ground with his hands up, and his sister's screaming, "Leave him alone. He's not, and he's crying. Like, he's scared. He's 19. He's scared." And they just had their guns all pointed at him. And then his 90-year-old grandma came out, and they pushed her on the ground, and she got hospitalized because they were worried she had a stroke. And that was this week too, I think, right? So it's like, okay, so all these things are happening. I just had to add that story to this like terrible salad that we're discussing of racism.
I'm glad you added that too, Sarah, because I forgot to mention that what George Floyd said when he was dying was "I can't breathe," which connects it to the killing of Eric Garner in New York, which a lot of people made that connection instantly. And this is not a problem that is situated in any one community. It's a national problem. Whether you mentioned Texas, so we could talk about the McKinney, Texas incident, or we can talk about Ferguson, Missouri, in places that most people have never heard of. Now, I was on the ground in Ferguson after Michael Brown was killed, and you encounter a school system and communities there that look very much like other economically depressed communities. Students or schools that are 98% free and reduced lunch, where you have deep structural inequalities that define the existence of the people that live there. And then people wonder why. And then you have over-policing, and then people wonder why those people explode with such frustration when something like that happens, of watching, a 16 or 17-year-old boy, gunned down police, or watching a person choked to death for selling cigarillos in the case of Eric Garner, or in the case of George Floyd, unfortunately being accused of forgery. So you're right. I think it's the collective. And then all of this, of course, is coming, just weeks after Ahmaud Arbery. We watched him die on television as two vigilantes are chasing him for supposedly walking through a construction zone. So this is, a bizarre moment, whereas everyone's talking about solidarity in COVID, we're still watching Black bodies be brutalized and killed in this way, and it's destabilizing.
Definitely. And you keep hearing people say, whether it's narrators on car commercials or your local newscaster, they say, "We're all in this together."
Right.
And I think that might be the headline for this moment, right? Because it feels a little ironic, because are we in this together? But this is a perfect segue, because I think I don't want to keep you for too long. What are our next steps? Because I know you're very much involved in Black Lives Matter, and now obviously in education, always have been involved in education. But what do we do with all this information, all this terrible news, reminding us that our country hasn't come that far since 1865 or 1619, or even really, I'd say before then, because that wasn't the first. Well, we can get into that another time. But 1619 is that pivotal years, right? So what do we do? Like, can things get better? How? I mean, I'm always asking how I can help, not be a performative ally. This is one way I can do it. Continue to educate. Not take up all the air in the room, listen, learn from the people who are actually experiencing this. But what can everyone do, whether they're white, Black, brown, Asian, combination, whatever? What do we do?
I think one of the interesting things is, and this was why it was so important that Amy Cooper situation played out at the same time, is really get to understand and study and appreciate what white privilege is. Because that was a moment where literally, if you don't understand white privilege, you saw it on display in exactly how you described it, that this woman could call, make an allegation about somebody, escalate that based on the color of the supposed perpetrator's skin. And you saw the way that people reacted to that. And that's really, damning. So one of the first things is just kind of read and study and acquaint yourself with the historical and sociological frameworks and foundations for why we have these problems. The second thing is not to, because I think last night is an indication of what you shouldn't do. The reality is, I'm a big proponent of incremental change. And there were those who argue that, well, it's the same as it was in 1619 as it is today. I disagree with that. I would say that it's even different over the course of 5 years. 5 years ago, or when Trayvon Martin was killed, George Zimmerman wasn't arrested immediately. And neither were these gentlemen in Alabama, but now they're in jail and charged with murder. the
Right.
police officers for a long time would go on administrative leave. Even in my own family in 1938,
Oh yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's horrific, but there are always these incidents where police get put on administrative leave, or in some cases, no leave at all, and continue to work while they're being investigated. In this case, the mayor of Minneapolis and police chief here ordered the immediate firing of those officers. So we have to value incremental change and small change. That's a step in the right direction. So we want to celebrate that. At the same time, we can't let our guard down. And I think part of the message here is that if you're not already involved in something, find a way to be part of the constructive conversation about moving that forward. What are the lessons that we can take from Minneapolis that we want to apply in the next case, so that each time, and it's sad to admit this, things get a little bit better rather than getting worse. 5 years ago, if we were having this conversation, we would have been talking about stop and frisk, thanks to the activism of people like some of the students in your class. Stop and frisk is gone. So activism works, but it has to be constructive. And we have to think about it in this way. Nelson Mandela put it best. I mean, I look to the South Africa example all the time in terms of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. When this is all said and done, we have to be able to live together too. This is not nihilistic. At the end of the day, we want to live in a society where everybody's valued. And incremental change means that women didn't have the right to vote until 1920. And we still don't, but we're on that journey, and we have to see that through. And sometimes that means taking one step forward and 3 steps back, but to celebrate the incremental change in between.
I love that. And I think a lot of the term incremental change might be new to people. Can you define it? Can you define 2 things for us?
Sure.
Because I think that the kids hear this stuff all the time, but I want them to be able to explain it in a really simple way to people. Define white privilege, in a sentence or 2. I think we all know what it is. I know what white privilege is, but I want them to have the definition of it, and I want them to have a definition of incremental change, because I think that'll be helpful too, because I think education is a form of activism, right?
I agree with you. And Sarah, you and I talk about this all the time. Academic jargon sometimes ends up hurting our ability to just communicate really simple concepts that people could use in their everyday conversation with others about the problem. So for young people, I always say white privilege is just the privilege of people believing you, or the power that you have based on the color of your skin and your zip code and where you live, right? The way that you're perceived because of who you are and what that represents. So African-American, Latino students are immediately at a disadvantage in most instances because people perceive them as being thugs, criminals, so on and so forth. White people who are perceived as white have the privilege that goes along with being perceived as being from a better socioeconomic background, a better class of person, so on and so forth. And we saw that play out in that phone call with Amy Cooper because she was playing on that privilege. Well, if I say this to the police and I say it's an evil black man, they're going to believe me because that's how people perceive of black people.
Right. And I always we'll get to incremental change in a second. The example I'm learning, just even I'm always learning. I think that's the thing too, to say, I don't know everything because I'm a recipient of white privileges in a way that I didn't even realize it. But the example I gave a couple of years ago, it was almost like the kids were like, wait, what, you can? And my example is, let's say I'm walking around wearing what I'm wearing, or even worse, workout clothes on the Upper East Side, fancy neighborhood, and I need to use the restroom. And the closest one is one of those 4-star, 5-star restaurants. In other words, a fancy restaurant for fancy rich people. And as a white woman, it doesn't even matter that I'm not even dressed well. I wouldn't give it a second thought to go walk up to the maitre d' and say, hi, can I use your restroom? Or lie and say, oh, I'm looking for a friend, because that's a good one. But don't do it if you're not me. Because if you're not a white lady. Because if you say, I'm looking for a friend in here, and you don't present like how I present, they'll be like, no, you're not. And I've used that line so many times because I had to use the restroom. And I didn't want to be weird and be like, can I use your restroom? I'll be like, oh, I'm just looking for someone. Usually they wouldn't even ask me where I was going. Right. Even though I was not dressed appropriately for this place. That is white privilege. And the privilege part was that I didn't even realize that I was getting away with that crap. Right. So that's the example I give. And half the time kids who are not white like me are like, wait, what? You would do that? I'm like, yeah, without thinking about it. That's white privilege. That's white privilege without really hurting anyone. but it is hurting people because I'm continuing to benefit from a privilege just because of the way I was born that I had no control over.
And I love the example you gave because it gets really crystal clear.
Yep.
And you're right. It's that, and that benefit manifests itself in other ways too. Some of those are very tangible and very concrete. We can kind of point to them, which is why there was a national conversation 2 years ago about reparations and whether Black people should get reparations for slavery because, it's the economic injustice that was visited upon communities of color by virtue of, discrimination as well. But I think that's a great, again, I think for most people, when they hear that language, it's hard to unpack it. But it's like those students, those young men who were denied the right to use the bathroom in a Starbucks in Philadelphia, right? Or stop and frisk is a good example of white privilege because the vast majority of those who were being stopped and frisked were people of color.
Oh yeah.
Other people were like, "Oh, it's fine," because the assumption was they weren't going to be impacted in the same way. It's the same concern some people have over masks, which everyone should wear.
Yes,
absolutely. But there's this concern that can become racialized too. And, of course, communities of color have to worry about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that you brought up the Starbucks incident. I forgot what I was going to say. If I remember, I'll think of it. Incremental change.
Mm-hmm.
What do we mean by that? Because I think there's a parallel to when we talk about the abolitionist movement. There was the gradualists and there was the immediate. I even forget the term.
Immediates, yeah.
Immediates, yeah. So what's the difference? What is incremental change, and how does that differ with maybe some other folk out there who are like, no, we need to do this right now? What is incremental change?
It just means, like in its most basic form for young people, just small changes. So you don't have to, and the best example I can give, I know you guys study, which is Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah.
On the surface, people thought that Brown versus Board of Education was going to be this major moment where the Supreme Court has declared separate but equal in education, the end that being the end of the segregation in America. And that didn't happen. It took years. The other example I give is in terms of incremental change. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. She wasn't the first person to do that. And there were many, many people after her who had to perform the same act of defiance in order for segregation to finally cease as a social system in the South, even if it was wiped away by the law. So incremental is just small change, and we celebrate small changes. Those small changes collectively over time end up making large change. And sometimes some people want to swing for the fences and they want revolution. And that'd be great if our society functioned in that way, but we don't ever want to discount small changes because small changes ultimately contribute to big changes.
That's perfect. Does anyone have any questions for what we've been talking about or clarification? We have a bunch of people here. It's great. This has been so, and I think my whole thing is that, like, if you're feeling kind of helpless right now because we really can't take to the streets, or, even if we want to, like, where's there to go? And, like, is it safe? Or you can't join a group right now. You can go online, but, like, maybe you don't know what groups to join. Just educating yourself, learning, not getting in Twitter fights or Snapchat fights just for the hell of it, but with the goal of educating. I told Dr. Williams a story that, like, I never use Facebook anymore, but, like, I posted something about anti-racism, and we can talk about that term, how people need to be anti-racist. We'll talk about them in a second. I posted something from, if anyone's curious, there's a really good resources on teaching tolerance that I posted, and someone, I won't even be specific because I'm recording this. Someone commented, "Wow, I use the term colorblind all the time, and I'm gonna stop. I didn't realize that's not good to say you're colorblind." Now, we've talked about this in my class, but I'm not sure if they remember. Does anyone want to comment and say why it's kind of dangerous, or I can't think of the right word, not good to say you're colorblind, like what you're implying there, or what you're negating when you say you're colorblind, when you're looking at other people? Anyone? What is it? Why is it problematic to say you're colorblind with race, quote unquote? See if anyone wants to answer. Why is it problematic to walk around saying you're colorblind. In other words, when you walk into a restaurant or a class or a store, you don't see people's race. So we got Winnie the you don't adjust for your own biases. Good.
Excellent.
So what does that mean exactly? I really like to break things down. What do we mean by that? Not adjusting for our own biases. Anyone else watching now? Oh, we lost you. Oh, there you are. So we don't adjust for our own biases. Did anyone say anything else? Oh, well, I guess, here, Noelle. It presents a post-racial mindset and disregards cultural backgrounds and dismisses actual racism. Yes. Both excellent. Noelle, nice. I hope we can save the comments. Take a screenshot of that comment. It's good. I think, did you freeze your? No,
I did for a second. I'm back
now. That's awesome. Yep. So I guess it's been about 37 minutes. So I want to let you go. Does anyone have any questions? Let's do like rapid fire questions. What questions do you have about other things related to this topic or stuff that came up in the conversation that spoke to you or further clarification? Does anyone have any questions? That's that awkward moment when you don't know if anyone's going to ask. Think of any questions you have. And they could also be, another interesting thing is, all this stuff aside, can you tell everyone what you do for a living? And it's related to a theme of the week at our school. It's college week. And a lot of the people tuned in right now are juniors looking to apply to colleges. Can you give them some advice? Tell them what you do in the higher education world and advice you might have for them as they're all about to start applying to colleges. So do you have advice for them?
I do. I'm Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences I am right now Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. But starting in July, I'll be Dean of the St. John's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at St. John's University in Queens.
Nice.
So back east. Yeah. And, as Dean, I'm the Chief Academic Officer for the college, which houses 22 academic departments and 10 programs, which are probably going to be in some areas that you guys would be interested in majoring in. So history, political science, psychology, English, just to name a few. And, I would say that the three most important things or pieces of advice I give young people about colleges are these. Number one, don't feel like you need to know what you're going to major in. Be open to the process of going in undecided and really kind of enjoy your core courses. Find your passion, because if you find something you're excited about doing and you're really interested in, it's never going to feel like work. It's always going to be exciting. I wanted to be a lawyer. I fell in love with history and ended up becoming a historian. And I'm so glad I did that because I love the work that I do. Number two is to be very intentional about thinking about what's a good fit for you in terms of the school itself. The social is just as important as the academic. So you want to be someplace where you're going to be comfortable and where you can feel like you can really be yourself. And the third is the best advice I can give you. It doesn't matter what you've done in high school. The great thing about going to university is it's an opportunity for reinvention. If you got great grades in high school, that's wonderful. You can continue that trajectory once you get to college. But if you didn't do as well, that's your opportunity to reinvent yourself. Take those things that you learned about how to study and apply them in a new context. If you were a little socially alienated in high school, nobody knows that. When you get to college, here's your opportunity to reinvent yourself. In the process of reinvention, we all can grow. And it allows us to kind of reimagine who we are and what we can do. Take that sense of confidence with you when you move on and think about schools and academic programs that will help you build that, and you'll get where you're going.
I love that. I'm so glad I'm recording this because everyone needs to watch that. It's related to what I was helping moderate a discussion yesterday, and I was talking to them about, like, when you're applying, they were asking like how to, present themselves. Like, well, focus on what your brand is. But I like adding on to the fact that, like, focus on what you want your brand to be. That's
Right.
like the next level. Like no one knows that like you were this way in school. You can just be like, this is what I want to be. And that's the brand you project into your next experience. So,
Very true.
I mean, Noelle just asked, how can he break down racial barriers? I kind of want to end on the note, on a positive note. So that's how you break down that barrier of like, how do I apply to college? So let's get back to something more macro to finish. So now we know what to do when applying to college. Let's finish with this question. It's a good finisher.
Sure.
How can I help with so how can Noelle and all of us help break down racial barriers? Like starting today from our bedrooms because we can't go anywhere.
Well, I love the question because I think, and I talked about this in a talk that I gave at University of Texas, Austin a couple of years ago. We tend to project, and we should, on our leadership a lot of times, responsibility for things that don't go well in our society as a whole. And we should hold leaders accountable. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the Constitution or the preamble reads, we the people. And that means there's a great deal of responsibility that falls on us to be active and engaged citizens. What does that mean? I love when the Muslim ban got pushed through, how people showed up at LaGuardia Airport
Yes.
and peacefully voted with their feet for freedom and equality, for our value system more consistent with what we would see as a social justice as opposed to a legalistic interpretation of our founding documents. So the first thing is just be familiar with what American democracy aspires to be, not what it is, because it's imperfect, but what it can be. It's exactly what you were saying a few minutes ago, Siri, when you were saying, you know, when we were talking about reimagination. You know, it's not what our democracy is in this moment. It's what we can imagine it to be at its best if we're careful caretakers of it. And that means, first and foremost, being educated about the issues. Secondly, being active and engaged in whatever form that means. A lot of times that gets reduced to voting, but it's not just about voting. It's
Right.
about civic participation, large writ. And that happens in a number of ways and this always blows students away, from wearing a mask, which is an act of civic participation and an act of showing respect to others, to making sure you do your best in school so that you'll be attentive and able and a contributing member of the larger society. And then the last one is, and this is very important, at least in terms of how we think about social justice, really thinking in concrete terms about how we level the playing field and making sure that we can ensure equal opportunity and equal access for others to enjoy the fruits of the democracy that we aspire to.
Ooh.
And that means whether we're talking about LGBTQ, whether we're talking about students who are Muslim, if we're talking about whatever the issue may be, anyone who's marginalized. So if we're going to play this all lives matter game, or anyone who finds themselves pressed to the margins, find a way to open the door wide enough so that they can partake in what we aspire to be our democracy at its best.
I love that. That's a great way to end. So if you have any other questions for Dr. Williams, you know, you can comment when I post this later or email me and I'll pass them on to him. And if you're interested in applying to St. John's, when you're starting to look at schools, he's your man, or he can direct you the person to talk to about that. But thank you so much for joining today.
I appreciate it. I hope to see some St. John's students here. Kellen, Winnie, Nishi, let's go.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Sari.
Thanks so much. Okay, bye, everyone. I'm going to post this so you can watch it later. And tell me, we have to do the extra credit roundup, so I hope someone noticed.